Good morning, welcome to a beautiful morning here. This is Port Phillip Bay behind me here in Melbourne. Now, before we start today, a very quick history lesson. So back in the 1930s, Qantas used to operate flights from Australia to the UK, just like they do now. But back then they were called Qantas Empire Airways, and the flights used to take 10 days, and they'd have to stop 30 times along the way. And there's one man here in Australia who wanted to recreate that epic era of aviation and started a trip flying a flying boat, not just here to the UK, but around the whole world. Now, his name is Michael Smith. He was voted the Australian Geographic Adventurer of the Year back in 2015, and that's who we're going to go meet today. So this is Port Phillip Bay just here in Melbourne. You've got the city just out of shot over to one side. Behind me is where the ferries go to Tasmania, you can see. And just over the other side of the bay is a place called Williamstown. And that's where the Royal Yacht Club of Victoria is based. And that's an important thing to know for this story, because that's where Michael set off from on his epic adventure, taking 7 months in a flying boat that has no autopilot and cruises at around 80 to 90 knots, flying around 25 countries and stopping 80 times on his own to fly around the world. Man, I thought my adventure flying around Outback Australia for 2 weeks in the Searey, I thought that was epic, but to meet someone who's flown around the world, I mean, this is something I've always wanted to do. I've got a bunch of questions about the route he took and the aircraft he flew, and I'd love to hear some of his stories along the way. So let's go meet Michael now. Can you tell us a little bit about the aircraft and why did you choose that as the plane that you wanted to fly?
Well, partly it's the plane I had, so it was partly the convenience, but here's one I prepared earlier. So this is the Searey. She's a wonderful little 2-seat, single-engine flying boat. Of course, it's a flying boat because the hull of the plane lands on the water as opposed to like a Cessna on floats. The wheels go up and down out of the way, but look, I was really enamoured by that old 1930s period when Qantas first flew from Sydney through to London, you know, and it went from taking 6 weeks by ship to only 10 days by air. It kind of has that look and feel of those old style planes. That's why I had painted it silver, so it looked like an old plane. And, you know, I used to often think, oh, gee, I wish I could have been on those Qantas flights back then. So I actually did some research into how could we charter a plane to retrace it. Couldn't make that work, and so decided to just do it in the plane I had, which was the Searey.
You had modifications made to the aircraft as well?
Yeah, quite a bit. So it instead of 4 hours fuel, it has 12 hours fuel built into it as into the fixed tanks. And then I had the ability to add a couple of extra bags, which would get me up to 21 hours fuel.
Before we just have a quick look at the route that you trace around the world, The one question that I want to know, and I'm sure everyone does, is why?
That's a good question. Look, I mean, I must point out it didn't start as a circumnavigation. I mean, since I was a 15-year-old boy reading books about Joshua Slocum, you know, other Robin Lee Graham, Chichester, these amazing mariners of the past, that I've always known that one day I wanted to sail around the world. And my plan here was actually just to retrace that Qantas route. I wanted to fly from Sydney to London in a flying boat, and I thought, you know, it was going to be an 8-week trip, and what an amazing life experience that would be. And, you know, I've always loved travelling. You know, I say I enjoyed flying, but I love travelling. And then I got to London, and the trip had gone so well. And my wife met me, and she said, "You sure you don't want to keep going? You know, you've always talked about doing a circumnavigation. Are you sure you don't want to keep going? I have this sense that if you don't keep going, that no sooner we get home than you'll start planning another trip." And so I did, but that drew it out from being just a 2-month trip. It ended up taking me 7 months, because as I quickly learned, actually going Sydney to or Melbourne to London was relatively easy. You're over land most of the time, plenty of airport options. But once I left London, you know, crossing the Atlantic became typically 8 to 10 hour flights.
So this is what I really want in my office, Michael. You've got the actual route that you flew around here in the office. This is cool. Can you give us an overview of, so where did you start? Where did you go?
Yeah, look, I do love a big map, right? So I started down here in Williamstown, which is where I live in Melbourne. I flew down to first a place called Raymond Island, which is in the Gippsland Lakes, which is an island where my mum lives. I landed on the water and pulled up to see her because I hadn't actually told her what I was doing. And it's important to tell your mum if you're going away for a while.
It is.
I landed at Rose Bay and I took off at 7 o'clock in the morning from Rose Bay to begin the actual retracing of the route, and stopped at some of the places that Qantas used to land. So they used to stop at Karumba for a refueling and Groot Island. And then this was the first time that I'd flown into Class Charlie airspace, first time I'd flown internationally. And it's amazing how nervous I was about this first leg, which ended up being about a 4-hour flight to Dili, which was interesting because none of the airports here had avgas, so we'd always have to go off to petrol stations and get petrol. Now, luckily, one of the great things about taking the Searey was with that Rotax engine, we could use avgas or petrol.
Gives you options.
And I had 8 flexible jerry cans with me, these bags that you can go off. So quite entertaining sometimes getting in a taxi and going to the petrol station and putting 160 litres of fuel in the boot and going back to the airport. Up into Singapore, and then up through Malaysia, Thailand, Chittagong. This is where I started. There were a few places that I wanted to land. I used to land on the river in Calcutta, but Indian authorities wouldn't let me do that. And worked my way across into Pakistan, Dubai. Now Dubai was really fun. So I landed at Dubai International Airport.
Cool.
Right? And can you imagine how intimidating it is? I'm coming down to land, and there's I work out there are 8 aeroplanes lined up waiting for me to land because they've had to make sure there's no wake turbulence, and there's an A380 at the head of the queue. And I worked out that there were about 3,000 people watching me land, so I really had to, the pressure. So I worked my way through. I had to land in Saudi Arabia to find a place where I could get fuel, into Akbar, where Lawrence of Arabia went, into Tel Aviv, and worked my way up through Europe, into Crete, and into Italy. Now, I did make a diversion from the original route. They used to land on a Lake Brindisi, but I went to Lake Como because the opportunity to land on Lake Como, which has got the oldest flying operational base there, and meet those amazing people. And my wife flew in commercially and met me there, and we had a lovely time before I then, went around to Marseille, up through France, and into Southampton. And Qantas, of course, didn't land in London on the Thames. They landed in Southampton. So I landed outside of Hythe, right on Southampton water where Qantas used to land, and which was pretty cool. Then headed up to London, and that was meant to be the end of the trip, but as I said, after chatting with Anne for a bit, I decided to keep going. So I went over to Ireland, up to Scotland, Iceland, which was just gorgeous. And then one of the most amazing parts of the trip was flying from Iceland across to Greenland. The most beautiful scenery because there was ice flow everywhere. So I was actually flying over the ocean at 500 feet. And then down to Canada, a couple of stops, and then into Maine to clear customs. And then I went to the airport and was kind of thinking, wow, geez, I've crossed the Atlantic, what do I do now? And I thought, well, I better fly the Hudson. I read up on the FAA notes on how do you do the transit down the length of Manhattan. And I flew down, and to be flying right next to New York City and looking down, and you see the Statue of Liberty, and you think, I can't believe I'm here. And as I was flying back, I thought, well, I suppose the next thing is I should land on the Hudson. So I made the call, Searey northbound over Intrepid, 800 feet descending to land on the Hudson. And I expected someone to get really excited, like, what the hell, why is someone landing on the Hudson? But there was just radio silence. But I did a splash and go on the Hudson and just thought, how cool is this? Someone else famously landed on the Hudson a couple of years before me.
Yes, they did.
But he left it there. Right. I went down to Florida and did the annual on the plane where it was built at the Searey factory in Florida. And then, I must say, this part of the trip was magnificent. I flew into New Orleans, and I decided that to get across America, I really wanted to fly the length of the Mississippi. It took me about a week to get from New Orleans all the way up to the source. So some nights I just land on the river, tie up to a tree on the bank. There's lots of little sand islands in the middle of the river. So I kind of felt like Huck Finn. It was just... Anyway, that was great fun, all the way across to Seattle, and then I worked my way up into Alaska. Now, most people, when they think about crossing the Pacific, they think about lots of fuel bags, going to Hawaii, and then, island hopping, but the Searey, couldn't get that far. So I had to follow up north and work my way across the Aleutian Islands to Adak. And here's where it got really interesting, because from Adak, I actually thought the trip was going to be over. I was trying to get permission to land in Russia, but after several months of trying, I finally accepted it wasn't going to happen. So I'm sitting here in Adak, and I worked out it would take me about 22 hours to fly from here to Japan, but the absolute maximum was 21 hours of fuel. But just as I was getting ready to give up, I was looking on Google Earth and I found that there was this island called Attu, which is an abandoned island. It was occupied during World War II. It used to be in the Cold War. It had a naval base there. On Google Earth, it looked like the runway was still there and in reasonable condition. And I worked out that if I flew the 5 hours to Attu, and if only I had fuel, then it would be about 19 hours to Japan. So I flew from Adak out to Attu, and I left some of my fuel bags on the side of the runway. And then I flew back to Adak. I waited a week for the weather to get better. And then on this really big day, I filled up the plane. I went and landed at Attu, topped up those extra 5 bags of fuel, and then took off again. An hour or two later, I took off and I flew what turned out to be an 18-hour flight down to Japan. 14 hours of that was in the dark because I wanted to arrive in Japan when in sunlight. So that was a very tough trip. I'm not IFR. I do have night VFR, but still it was so pitch black dark out there over the ocean. It was overcast. I had 30 knot tailwinds. So I did plan for a day when I had really good tailwinds. Yeah. I had 30 knot tailwinds for about the first third of the trip, and then they slowly petered out. But I ended up with down here where you can see that little curve is I had to make a diversion. As I got down here, there were 50 knot headwinds. I was doing 30 knots over the ground or over the water. And it turned out the airport was fogged in, so I had to divert to another part of Japan. I worked my way back down through Australia and, got home 7 months later. It was an incredible trip. I wasn't in a rush, obviously, because it took 7 months, but I made a real point of trying to at least have one day off between flying and sometimes two.
Now, you've got a book as well, Michael, and a video. So if you want to find out more about Michael's adventures and what he got up to, there's a book and a DVD available.
That's right. So go to southernsun.voyage. That's www.southernsun.voyage. And there's details, there's a story and photos on the web, but you can also buy the book and DVD.
Yeah, brilliant. It's a fascinating read. It really is. And the movie's well worth watching as well. You think movie first, then the book?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The movie's kind of the happy, beautiful way to see the trip, and then the book peels back the layers and explains some of what went right and what went wrong along the way.
It's awesome. You'll love it. You'll absolutely love it. It was really nice to meet you. Thanks, Michael. Thanks for your time.
Fantastic. Thanks.